The
Yes.
floor is now yours. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ilya, the Brazilians couldn't make it, and for various familiar reasons. And and David hasn't showed up so far. So it'll be you and Oleg right away after I just say a few brief words, if that's okay. Sorry to do this. I know you've already spoken earlier today, and given the events, I can only imagine how busy you've been over the last month, besides all the other social, political, personal pressures you're probably under from the events in Eastern Europe. Thanks to David and Michael Lardner for the Marxist Education Project for organizing this series of events in the Socialist Register 2022. New polarizations, old contradictions on the crisis of centrism. I've worked with Leo Panich for, I guess, now 12 volumes of the Register. And we worked on, I don't know, a dozen other publishing projects over the year. Tragically, he died as we were beginning to work on this volume. We had commissioned it, had started interacting with the authors, had kind of mapped out what we wanted to accomplish, and he was struck by cancer and then COVID in the hospital, so we lost him along the way. I was very fortunate to have Colin Lees come on board to edit the volume. Colin, of course, is one of the great Marxist intellectuals for several decades, writing on Britain, Africa, other parts of the world. Colin had edited the Register with had edited the Register with Leo for over a dozen years, and they had written some of Leo's together some of their great books on parliamentary socialism and British labor. So it was a great pleasure for me to work with Colin, to learn from him. I was fortunate to have actually worked with known Colin back to the 1980s in Canada when he was teaching at Queen's University in Kingston here. And we had worked on editing a journal, so it was kind of great fun to make connections and develop a working relationship with Colin again. And putting the volume together, we wanted to focus on the political polarizations that seemed everywhere. That was what we had, Leo and I had struck as seemed important to capture this moment in the context, essentially, we had conceived it longer term in terms of neoliberalism, but in particular in the context and the class transformations and new political configurations that are emerging in the span from the great financial crisis from 2008 to 10 to the pandemic crisis, and to capture that moment and not look at it just at the level of surfaces and appearances. That was kind of the way it was, polarizations were being discussed in the media, but try to penetrate the underlying mechanisms and social conflicts, social structures, which were laying behind the world of appearances of political polarizations. In that sense, it was in the sense of that Marx had laid out his own project, not that the world of appearances is false, but need to be explained by underlying contradictions and social structures and the political strategies of class agencies. We sought to gather essays in broadly three areas to capture this moment. One was on a set of issues that seemed important to tackle in themselves, on income and wealth polarizations, the pandemic, on social media, on the far right, on identity politics, all that we managed to get terrific essays from, Simon Mahon, Walden Bello, Jihadi Ghosh, Marcus Gilroy Ware, Ingar Salty, so some of the big named writers around the world on these issues. It also seemed necessary to take on what had obviously been animating all of us where we live, is some of the dimensions of political polarization in the societies we live in. And it seemed to us, when we conceived this, Leo and I were thinking especially of the states that had been characterized especially as the zones of social and political polarization. Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia, Germany and Central Europe around the far right, and then the politics that had exploded in a very visually in forms of political polarization in the U.S. Around Black Lives Matter to, of course, the events that had stamped the Trump administration. So that was the second kind of area that we wanted to make sure we had fairly comprehensive coverage of these different zones of the world. The third was to look at the left and alternatives, and in the context which we had been posing for quite a while in the register in terms of some notion of polarized options with the crisis of centrism and the evacuation from the left of social democracy having moved and become integrated as a set of as a political options or political forms of neoliberalism themselves in power. The other was also to think about this in terms of what was revealed in terms of the Corbyn project about those polarized options, following on the heels of some of the other developments in Europe around Podemos in Spain or in Syriza in Greece, and take on those themes of what a new left might look like. And of course, it was also the question of how seriously and how to assess the Biden project of Build Back Better. So those are the the areas that we attempted to cover in the volume. I think it's really a very interesting and strong volume. Of course, I have my commitments to it, but it also is, I think, we still see so few studies of kind of that question directly. Although we're talking about it all the time, about attempting to theorize and think through the different forms of polarization and try to assess this conjuncture together. I think one of the important essays, one of the most important essays in the volume is exactly that, coming from Ilya Matveev and Oleg Servalov on social sources of political polarization in Russia. One of the paradigmatic cases of since the collapse of the Soviet Union and passing through the period of shock therapy that most of us who are have followed to different degrees closely, and has been a focal point for any of us who are socialist and thinking about the trajectory of capitalism over the last 30 or 40 years, has been following that very closely. Both Ilya and Oleg are at the Public Sociology Laboratory at the Center for Independent Social Research in St. Petersburg. It is one of the outstanding sources of independent assessments of Russian politics, social opinion, and everything else that sociologists and others do. So I think that's all I have to say. David's not here, as far as I can tell, so no need to introduce him. And I'll turn it over to Ilya, who wanted to speak at 3, but is now speaking a lot earlier. And I know he spoke earlier today, so he's certainly putting in his hours of labor. Thank you. Ilya?
Thank you so much. Thank you. So it's actually not a problem for me to speak earlier than 3, but Oleg will come a little later, because so I confused the time difference. It's actually 9:30 where I'm here. So yeah, it's pretty late. So I actually have a PowerPoint.
Okay.
Can you give me the right to show it?
Michael should be able to set you up to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Ilya, you are now a co-host and can do whatever you want.
Oh, thanks so much. So this is a PowerPoint. Can you see it? Is everything okay? Okay, thank you. So when I received the invitation to talk about my article in the volume of Socialist Register, I actually couldn't even imagine that this will be under these circumstances. So the war changes everything. That's, you know, the bottom line of what I'm going to speak about today. So the war changes everything. The war changes everything in Russia. It's a completely different country now. And I think that the war changes everything globally as well. So it's basically a world historic event. So what I will try to do today is, first of all, to talk about our article, to name the main points and unpack the main points in a brief way. And I will also try to examine whether any of those points are still relevant, in fact, after you know, the war began. And I think some of them are. I think that some of our analysis is still relevant today, and our article sort of illuminates tendencies that emerged in the last month in Russian politics, in Russian society. So in some way it is helpful. So it's not completely dated, in fact. So I will begin by talking about the article. It is called Loft Offices and Factory Towns, Social Sources of Political Polarization in Russia. So what we meant by this title was that some people still work in industrial and, you know, in industry, in factories. These factories in Russia, many of them are located in company towns, because in the Soviet Union, cities were built around industry. They were built around factories. So a lot of cities actually have a single factory that provides work for everyone, and this became emblematic of the problems in Russian society in the 90s, for instance, because all these factories closed down, and all those cities that relied on a single factory, they were left with nothing. So factory towns are an image of you know, Soviet working class that is under threat by these new capitalist conditions. And loft offices basically indicate a new group of people, you know, urban middle class professionals, so who emerged in the 2000s, in the 2010s. So they're highly educated, and they work in creative industries. They work in various professional office jobs, and they represent a different class. So our title was a reference to basically a class basis, not just a social basis, but a class basis of potential polarization in Russian society. So we made several claims. The first claim was that Russian society was highly polarized in the 90s. So on the one hand, there was a liberal or democratic camp, and this camp was presided by Boris Yeltsin, the president of the country. And on the other hand, there was the so-called red-brown opposition, so the Communist Party that emerged after collapse of the Soviet Union. So it was the main opposition to Yeltsin's rule, essentially. And the problem with this opposition was that it united leftist tendencies and nationalist tendencies, in fact. So it was a combination of sort of nostalgic communist and nationalist opposition and liberal democratic camp that was in power. And there was a true polarization in society. So people did not vote for centrist parties in the 90s in Russia. And there was still a semblance of democracy, so votes were actually counted, and voting records revealed that people either voted for this liberal camp, extreme liberal camp, or they voted for this rather extreme, rather radical red-brown opposition. And there was a class dimension to this, in a sense that workers and peasants supported the Communist Party. They supported the opposition. and people who lived in big cities, educated people, the emerging middle class, the emerging, professional class. They supported the liberal camp, and they supported Yeltsin. And there was a clear dividing line between the classes. And studies actually demonstrated the connection between the class position of people in society and their political views and their voting patterns. So there was a clear connection between class and vote. And in the next decade, in the 2000s, this actually changed because the polarization that existed in society in the 90s, it almost disappeared under Vladimir Putin's rule. And the reason was that people retreated into private life. They were no longer interested in politics at all. And Putin actually liked it that way. He preferred to rule over this depoliticized society, which was not interested at all in participating in politics. And this allowed the Kremlin, this allowed Putin to build an authoritarian regime because society was not, ready to oppose this kind of development. There was a sort of unspoken pact between the population and the Kremlin. And the pact was that the Kremlin is enriching itself, these people are enriching themselves, they engage in rampant corruption, and on the other hand, they do not interfere in the lives of ordinary people. And then there is economic growth, and so the people do not interfere with the Kremlin does not interfere with the people. And this was the basis of Putin's rule in the 2000s. So polarization receded, and there was no true political conflict in society. But then things changed again in the next decade, in the 2010s. So a new opposition movement emerged. In 2011, 2012, it was a period of mass protests in Russia with 100,000 people in Moscow. So the biggest demonstration in late 2011 was 100,000 people, maybe even more. So it was completely unprecedented because nothing like that happened in the previous decades. When Putin just came to power, opposition to Putin existed of maybe hundreds of people. And then suddenly this new movement broke out that consisted on hundreds of thousands of people. And I would say that this threat to the regime has never been completely extinguished. So even now, after a decade of repression, after a decade of crazy propaganda, still Russian society is more politically active than it was in 2000s. So this sort of genie of political activity was left out of the bottle, and it is still there, even now, even in the condition of this war. So still Russian society is more politically active than it was in the 2000s. So in the article, we investigate the class nature of this opposition movement. And we come to the conclusion that indeed there is a class basis to this. And this new opposition movement is a middle class movement, essentially. It's a movement of urban professionals, of people with higher education. And in that sense, its class basis is rather narrow. So it has always been a problem for the opposition movement in Russia. Those people who oppose Putin, that the social basis of this movement was narrow. And until very recently, even the leaders of the movement were not really interested in expanding, the class basis of this movement. So they were liberals, and they were not interested in incorporating, for instance, the working class into this movement. And our argument is that Alexei Navalny has always been different from other opposition leaders in Russia because he is a populist politician. He's a populist politician in the sense that he wants to build a cross-class coalition and his populist appeals. With them, he tries to unite Russian society and to include those people who were not previously included in the opposition movement. And this is why Navalny became the most powerful opposition leader. This is why he became the most threatening opposition leader, the most threatening to the regime. This is why ultimately Putin decided first to kill him, and then he could not succeed, so to imprison him. Because Navalny's populist tactics proved to be quite successful in expanding the social basis of the opposition movement. But this process was stopped short by repression, by brute force. So in the article we show that when the mass movement emerged in 2011, 2012, the Kremlin responded first of all with propaganda, with an ideological offensive, and this was the time when the Kremlin started to emphasize nationalist rhetoric. And now we see the fruits of this, emergent nationalism on the part of the Kremlin. So now this great Russian chauvinism developed into full ideology of ethnic cleansing, unfortunately, towards Ukrainians. But this started a decade ago in response to this opposition movement. The Kremlin also emphasized conservative themes, traditionalist themes, and at this time Putin decided to become the leader of reactionary forces of the world. So he maybe a year ago he gave an interview to Financial Times, I think, in which he claimed that liberalism is dead globally, and it's time of traditional values, it's time of conservative values. And Russia represents these traditional values, conservative values, and so on. But initially, this was a response to the opposition movement. So this did not emerge spontaneously. This was a calculated response to political threat. And the second thing that the Kremlin used was repression. So in the last decade, Russian regime became much more repressive than it was before. And this has gotten worse and worse and worse with every year, basically. So the very important thing was that the Kremlin relied on propaganda, on ideology. It relied on repression, but it never created its own loyalist street movement. So this was rather stark. This was striking because on the one hand, you have tens of thousands of people going on the streets opposing the regime. On the other hand, there are no people on the streets supporting the regime. So in that sense, it's a stark contrast with countries like Venezuela, for instance, where you have the opposition, which is a mass movement, but you also have people who are loyal to the ideas of Hugo Chavez, and it is also a street movement. So in Russia, nothing like that ever happened. So people who are loyal to Putin, they stay at home and they watch TV. And this is the only thing that is required of them by the regime, right? So the Kremlin has always been afraid of grassroots activity of any kind, even the loyalist kind. Even the people who actually support Putin's ideas. So the Kremlin has never allowed them to actually do anything on their own. So the regime only tolerates its own creations. So if the regime sends people to beat some opposition activists, then it's okay. If it's a spontaneous activity, then these people will be persecuted. And this is a rather important feature of Putin's regime. Rejection of any kind of grassroots activity and deep suspicion towards any kind of grassroots activity in society. So when we move to the recent Russia's political history, so the last year or so, we saw that Navalny returned to Russia. He was immediately imprisoned, as you know, and he also his organization launched this famous investigation into Putin's own personal corruption, into the palace that Putin built, or some friends built it for him in the south of Russia. And these two events, this investigation and Navalny's imprisonment, started a political crisis. And Navalny managed to mobilize actually hundreds of thousands of people across the country again and reinvigorate the opposition movement. But and this demonstrated once again that this problem of opposition activity has never been solved by the Kremlin. So the only thing that the Kremlin could do was to just persecute everyone, and this is exactly what they did. So police presence on the streets was just completely incredible. A year ago, when these demonstrations happened, so I was demonstrating with other people, and this was well, first of all, this was quite scary because there was like riot police everywhere and so on. But then just the sheer amount of police presence on the streets was completely incredible. And what they managed to do was to just disperse all these demonstrations, and something like 20,000 people in total were arrested, and a lot of them received short-term prison sentences, like 15 days, 30 days, and some of them, maybe about 100, received criminal sentences for like a year, 2 years, 3 years. So the only instrument left to the Kremlin was repression, basically. But unfortunately, in the short term, it's a rather effective instrument, because when you just destroy the opposition movement that is not ready to move from peaceful protest to anything else, then this opposition movement cannot exist, basically. So, and this is the point where we stopped our narrative in the article. So it's not a very positive outlook, but at least we sort of registered that opposition to Putinism is becoming more diverse. It now includes more people from the Russian regions. It includes more working class people. It includes more poor people. And the logic of this opposition between united people and corrupt elite sort of makes the social basis of the movement wider. So this was a positive development. But then the war happens, and the question is anything from our article relevant at the current moment? So first of all, my position is that Russia is currently descending into a form of fascism, or what Ernst Traverso, a leftist thinker, calls post-fascism. I would say that Russian state is a fascist state at the moment. Sorry. Okay. Nevertheless, the points that we made in the article, that the Kremlin completely rejects any kind of bottom-up activity, it still holds. So even now, the regime does not allow, for instance, pro-war demonstrations. All of them. So the nationalist activists tried to organize demonstrations supporting the war, but they all were denied permits to do this, and this never happened. So the only street movement that Kremlin allows is a kind of spectacle of a demonstration organized by the Kremlin itself. So they just use public employees. They go on buses to Moscow from nearest regions, and then there is this huge sort of rally, or more like a performance. And Putin has spoken at this performance. But they do not allow loyalist demonstrations, even from Russian nationalists, even now. And recently, a bookstore that is operated by some nationalist, intellectuals, it was raided by police, even though those intellectuals supported the war. And they completely share all Putin's ideas about the non-existence of Ukrainian nation and so on. So they actually agree with Putin on everything, but still they were raided by police. This is a peculiar way of relating to society. So Russian state is a fascist state, I would say. Currently, it is a fascist state. Ideologically, it moved towards ideology of sort of nationalist superiority and even ethnic cleansing of Ukrainians. So the things that are published on Russian official news sources, official newspapers, for instance, those articles, they are completely, this is like Völkischer Beobachter, basically. But at the same time, any kind of grassroots activity in support of this, it is not allowed. And this is a point that we made in our article. Secondly, I would say that there is literally no place left for the opposition movement in its previous form. So politically, the level of repression is such that any kind of independent political activity, any kind of opposition activity is basically impossible in Russia. It is, so it's met with criminal sentences, it's met with prison time. So any criticism is also completely prohibited, and all independent media are banned in Russia. Even the most long-standing newspapers, such as Novaya Gazeta, the editor of Novaya Gazeta, Dmitry Muratov, was awarded the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize recently, and Novaya Gazeta is closed now. So this was the last independent news source standing in Russia. Now it is closed. So there is no political space for the opposition movement. There is no cultural space because any kind of non-isolationist, let's say, ideology, it is impossible to sustain it in Russia. So it is going towards extreme nationalism, basically, in every sphere of life, and even economically. So, like I said, the class basis of the opposition movement was this middle-class professionals in big cities, and because of the economic crisis, because of the impact of sanctions, that is extreme and very severe. So sanctions are working, very effectively towards destroying the Russian economy. So because of the impact of sanctions, those people who participated in opposition activities, basically they have to leave Russia now. So, and according to some people, at least 500,000 people left Russia in the last month. So 500,000 people, that is incredible. Based on this, it's very hard to say, something positive, right? It's very hard to say, to provide a sort of positive outlook for the future, because I would say that I'm still shocked by what happens. And like I said in the beginning, war changed everything in Russia. I can only hope that a combination of strain on the elite that is put by sanctions, by economic crisis, by everything, and bottom-up discontent with extreme poverty that is coming to Russia, with complete lack of prospects in the future. So a combination of elite defection and popular protest will lead to some political change. So this might be possible, but at the same time, the infrastructure of repression that Putin's regime has built is extremely strong. It's just hundreds of thousands of people whose only task is to prevent any kind of political change from happening. So in that sense, the prospects are rather bleak, I would say. Nevertheless, I want to emphasize that anti-war movement in Russia still exists, and some activities are carried out, and they are mostly symbolic now, but I think it's very important because they reveal that there is a tension in Russian society, that beneath the surface, actually millions of people reject this war. They just do not have a way to express this. They do not have a way to effectively politically express this. So maybe this will change in the future. So this is what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you. That was a bit tough, but I thought I'm going to turn it over to David, but I was just going to say to Ilya, I thought I reread your article, and I thought it still had a lot to say about the underlying decay and polarization that no kind of movements had been able to break out, and therefore had prepared the foundations for the inability of an anti-war movement to easily arise. So much along the lines you had spoken to. I'll turn it over to David to kind of manage the Q&A.
Okay.
And if you could take your PowerPoint off.
Yeah, you want to take the PowerPoint down? Anyway, is Oleg going to be joining us at some point, and would he want to? Okay.
Oleg might connect at 10 o'clock, so at 3 o'clock. Like he cannot do it.
Okay.
Before.
Well, if he wants to say more at that time, I mean, probably can, because David Harvey hasn't appeared, so this will be our discussion. Usually, the plan is for people to if you want to make a comment or ask a question, you type stack in the chat, S-T-A-C-K in the chat, and then I will call on you. And we have a request from Previn to speak. So, Mike, if you want to unmute yourself, Previn, then go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
Oh, thanks, David. Yeah, Ilya, very, very hard to listen to what you were saying there. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, when Navalny was poisoned, I think he went to Germany for treatment, yeah? And I just could not understand why he went back to Russia, because it was so obvious that they were going to either arrest him or kill him again. And this idea of trying to, if you like, run an opposition from within a dictatorship country seems to be a high-risk strategy. I get the ideological purity of doing that. I understand that it might give you some kind of great moral feeling that you're doing the right thing, but tactically, it doesn't seem very sensible. And it seems, you know, when you think of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin organizing the revolution mostly outside Russia, that would be a sensible tactical move for the oppositions, rather than fighting from within. And especially in Navalny's case, where it was so obvious, they were going to just do something to him, you know. So I don't understand why, when he had that opportunity when he was in Germany, he didn't stay there and stay in Europe and run the campaigns from there, because he had the broad base anyway. I think he's decentralized the whole opposition movement anyway, so it wasn't that reliant on him as a cult figure. So that's one thing that really puzzled me. I never kind of got to the bottom of that. Another quick question, if I may, it just concerns you. You are in St. Petersburg, is that right, in Russia? Is that correct?
No, I'm currently in Istanbul. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's a different. Yeah, because I was just wondering how. All right, so you're a good example of that, because I was just wondering how opposition movements are surviving in Russia, because they're just going to be smashed. And this is just not the time, it seems to me, to, you know, for the activist centers of thinking to be working from within the country. And my last question was simply if you have any information on where are the centers of opposition now in Russia, given that it's a dictatorship.
Right. Thank you. So I will start with the question about Navalny. Actually, so first of all, the idea that he would be able to organize something in Russia from afar, unfortunately, probably it would not have worked, because his organization was completely dismantled. right? So he had a network of branches in different Russian cities, and this was actually quite effective. So people from his organization, they even were able to elect their own candidates in some local assemblies, even under the conditions of, Russian completely unfair elections. Still, they were able to place their candidates. They were very actively fighting on several fronts, and his organization was quite strong. But then it was just, dismantled. It was deemed extremist by court. So the Russian court, equated Navalny's organization with ISIS, for instance. It's the same legal status now, and it was just completely destroyed. And then, what could he do from afar? So he could record the videos, but then his closest associates can also record those videos, right? So he did not have any special ability to do the things that other people in his team are currently doing. And in fact, he was the only one who returned to Russia. All of them, they actually left Russia. So all of his associates, all of the people closest to him, they left Russia, and they now operate from, I don't even know which country, actually. They do not like to publicize it, but they're not in Russia at the moment. So Navalny's organization, the key members of his organization, they are not in Russia. And Navalny himself, in light of what I just said, his return to Russia was basically the way to claim, moral right to be a leader, I would say. And perhaps, probably it doesn't matter that much, but at the same time, after the war, I finally understood what was the purpose of his return. Because before that, I asked myself the same question as you asked. So why couldn't he just do something from Europe, for instance? But now I understand that he is one of the very few people who have the moral right to speak, on behalf of Russia. If Russia has any kind of future outside of Putin, then Navalny will be, the person who would say, I went to prison for my beliefs. So now, despite what our country did, I actually took responsibility. I took responsibility, and now I have the moral right and moral standing to speak. I think this will be very important. But yeah, so it was sort of heroism. Navalny, he has a lot of problems. So, like everyone knows, his beginnings as a nationalist, which he eventually rejected. But still, he's not the friend of the left in any sense. He's not a leftist person. But at the same time, as a politician, I think he is tending towards this sort of heroic position, right? So, like Nelson Mandela. And I would say that at the current moment, after the poisoning, after his imprisonment, under actually completely awful conditions. So he's now quite close to Mandela in the way, he suffered. So, yeah, this is how I would answer. So in terms of my own personal safety, unfortunately, people who still speak up against the war or against Putin in any way, the absolute majority of them have to leave. It's impossible from Russia. It's impossible to do from Russia because there is now a criminal sentence for discrediting Russian army, discrediting everything that Russia does, basically. And so any criticism of the war, and even calling the war a war and not special operation, this is now punishable by law. And so, yeah, so it's just impossible to do anything while staying in Russia. So, yeah. And I don't want to be like Navalny. It's not, unfortunately, it's not in my character. I don't feel enough I don't know what. I don't feel enough stamina to do this. So, so yeah, that's about me. On the other hand, some people do stay in Russia. So I think the logical way is for people who stay in Russia, first of all, not to speak publicly. There is a sort of division of labor that people who stay, they try to gather information, they try to talk to people. And in fact, there is something, like some potential for agitation in the working class now, because workers are dismissed. Like tens of thousands of people are dismissed because of the sanctions, because of the economic crisis. There is a discontent in factories. It is sort of slowly boiling. It is slowly emerging, and some like socialist activists try to influence that. But those who speak publicly, it's impossible for them to stay. Those who do not speak publicly, they can try to stay, but it's obviously like very dangerous, and also the prognosis is bad. So it could get much worse in the future, because Russia is probably like it will probably lose this war. So like there is a real potential for Russia to literally lose the war and not achieve any of its objectives in the war. And after that, I don't even want to think of what Putin will do inside the country, because this will be a sort of revenge for his failure to do what he wanted in Ukraine. So Russian society will bear the brunt of his anger for this. So yeah, in terms of safety of activists, it's doesn't look good. So what kind of opposition exists? So in terms of what people can still do, these are small scale things like graffiti, like stickers, some performances that people did, like people lying on the streets and repeating the scenes from these massacres in Bucha and other places. So there is a feminist movement is actually extremely active, and feminists launched an anti-war feminist initiative, and they're documenting stuff, and like they're very active in different ways. So single person pickets, for instance, you go to the street and you hold a banner, so this ends very quickly with you being arrested, but still you can do this, so stuff like this. In terms of actual like actions, it's a very limited repertoire of action, but something can be done. And like the positive thing here, if there is anything positive, is that a lot of people reject this war. It's actually a very sizable part of society. And I know that there are these opinion polls that say that, it's like 85% of people support the war and 15% of people reject the war. So the polls are, these results are invalid methodologically, because people who are against the war, they're afraid to even respond to pollsters. And this is completely understandable, because any criticism of the war is punishable, by law. And then suddenly someone asks you the question, so do you support the war? And then it doesn't make sense to answer, no, I do not support the war. So you don't even know where your answer will be recorded. So in that sense, any polls coming from Russia, this is an important point. They are just meaningless. All these numbers, they do not tell anything. And like some sociologists try to do a sort of, indirect poll. There is a technique, it's called least experiment, when they try to sort of hide this question among other questions. And when they did this, their result was like 50% of people actually expressed support for war, if they were asked in this indirect way, where their answer could not be identified. So 50% and not 80%. This is closer to reality. I think that there is a split in Russian society, so a polarization, if you want, and half of the people do not support the war, but it's impossible for them to express that under current conditions.
Yeah, if I could just briefly come back to you on that one, and just to say that there's two kind of oppositions. One is the activist populist stuff, and as you said, Navalny's not a left-wing guy anyway, right? Mm-hmm. But he's just opposition, so we all kind of hang on to him. But okay, so there is the populist opposition, and you can try and take out Putin that way. What I feel is another vacuum is an ideological opposition, and that the ideological center, whether it's inside or outside Russia, but an ideological opposition has not been organized. And again, maybe I'm just crazily nostalgic about the Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin era, pre the revolution. But there's something about starting ideological centers outside the country of dictatorship that can, in its time, in its historical moment, if the doorway opens, that you can get in. And of course, that ideological center then becomes the basis of future government. And that's kind of what happened in October 1917. And that there seems to be this obsession with, we've got to fight Putin on the streets and stuff, which of course we do, But it's not the only way. And of course, the left has this vacuum now, of intellectual, like an intellectual vacuum where we don't present ourselves for whatever reasons, embarrassment, failures, conflicted, rethinking, regrouping. But I think Russia particularly, or the dictatorship countries, need ideological centers more than ever, because I think people will respond. I think they will. Because within that ideological center, you'll find the one or two people who can communicate to the population and simplify the more complex arguments. And I feel the left is badly missing that. And this is the time, it's happening. It's capitalism is not crumbling, but it's in crisis. This would be a good time to set up an ideological center, even if it's in Istanbul. Good luck.
Yeah. So yeah, I actually agree. And what we've always tried to do is to present a consistent analysis, and not just, as opposed to Navalny's populism, which is extremely eclectic. At some point he wants to provide like social safety nets. At another point he wants to privatize, state enterprises. So it's very like inconsistent. And this is the definition of populism. It's like moving in different directions. And so the left has always tried to present some kind of programmatic alternative to this. And we write about this in the article. And this is the task for us. So this is what we should do. We should try to think of reforms for Russia from a leftist perspective. Think of, a program, actually, even though, it's not clear who will implement this program. But I agree that we need to think of a program. And Oleg actually joins, I think, right now, and this was his point all along. So he always claimed that we need to think about the program. We need to think about the program that we will present to the population. So maybe he will elaborate on this if he is here.
Great. I didn't see Oleg, but
Can you hear me?
Here. There he is.
Oh yes, there he is. Okay, I see him. Before that, Peter Fay, you posted, you linked an article about polling in Russia. Did you want to say anything about that, or was you have to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi. I was just posting information which is different from what we're hearing. I don't really, I don't have much response to this other than it's what I'm hearing today is not really very different from what I hear from, MSNBC or any other, American news source. There seems to be, I'm not sure what, to me, this doesn't sound really like a leftist analysis of what's going on, but I'm not an expert on Russia, so I guess I really don't have a whole lot to say. I just wanted to point out that there seem to be counter arguments to what we're hearing, that Putin's popularity is soaring, but of course those are polls, so I I don't really have a whole lot to add.
So should we let Oleg speak if he wants to
Of course.
add anything?
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead, Oleg.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I skipped the whole discussion, but concerning the programmatic ambitions of the Russian left, I would say that it is not only our duty, it is also our chance and our opportunity to promote ourselves, because liberals, including populist figures like Alexei Navalny, they had been very successful in terms of street mobilization of people in Russia, but and this is what we cannot do, unfortunately. leftists cannot mobilize much people in the streets now. However, the same liberal mainstream politicians, including Navalny himself, they made the very genre of political debates over the programmatic issues very popular and attractive for wider audience. And within these circumstances, we can promote ourselves as people who had been working on reforms about which Ilya just was talking about. So due to the popularity of this genre of public debates over programs, leftists who are quite successful in articulation and development of these programmatic issues can be seen more powerful than liberal opposition. So that's our idea.
Mm-hmm.
Oleg, were you
Okay.
answering the comment from Peter, or did you have your own presentation you would like to make for today?
No.
Okay.
So we can move to other questions, perhaps.
Yes.
Michael, you were on stack since Oleg has muted himself.
Okay. I wanted to know, with all of this, the Western bourgeois powers have, besides all the sanctions that are destroying life for day-to-day living in Russia, they've also been attacking the various oligarchs and speak as though all the oligarchs are a united bloc with Putin. Is there any type of are there fissures developing in the ruling amongst the ruling kleptocrats on where this that are causing any erosion of Putin's base with the class that he represents? I don't, like the one person commented, I don't trust our news sources very well, but I would think that there must be some divisions, but the repression is so thoroughgoing and everyone has watched so much. I don't know if it gets any air within Russia, but outside, many of these oligarchs have remained in their towers on Central Park South or in their yachts, etc., wherever they happen to be. So I just wonder if there is some type of fissure in the ruling group in Russia.
Right. So I can try to answer that. And to us, as Marxists, this has always been the central question, right? So how to explain the fact that Russian imperialism in recent years goes directly against the interests of the ruling class? Because in previous periods, we saw that Putin's regime was actually extremely beneficial to the oligarchs in terms of their personal enrichment. So they made most of their fortunes during Putin's period, not during the 90s. In fact, during Putin's period, and the number of billionaires increased absolutely dramatically. But my points, well, before this happened, in my analysis, I tried to develop this notion that a Russian regime is a Bonapartist regime, in the sense that Putin caters to the interests of the oligarchs, of the billionaires, but at the same time, he is not beholden to them politically. So they have no influence. They have no real influence on him. They can only hope that that he will continue to support their ambitions. They can only hope that this will happen. And like Marx said about Napoleon III and about the bourgeoisie, so Napoleon was actually representing the bourgeoisie, but the state always threatened the position of the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie understood that the state could turn against them as well. And I think this is what happened. So previously they enjoyed the benefits of Putinism, but now they can no longer do this because for some reason Russian regime decided to do this imperialist expansion that actually goes completely against the interests of this globally integrated, ruling class. And there is definitely a tension, even by public pronouncements. You can see that several big corporations in Russia made public statements that they want, the hostilities to end, that they want peace. So this was all very subdued, very, accurate, but still they expressed this sort of discontent with what's going on. And in some cases, it was an attempt to avoid sanctions, actually. So they say that, this war is bad, so please do not sanction us. So something like this. But I think that the companies are getting, the oligarchs, they're getting more and more frustrated with what's going on. But the problem is they cannot do anything. In a Bonapartist regime, bourgeoisie has no real political power. So as Marx pointed out precisely. And ultimately, if they're not happy, then I think the government will nationalize their companies. So this is the end point. If they really want to protest, then they will just lose their assets in Russia. They're just those siloviki, those FSB people, they will just take over their assets. And this is why, even though there is a tension, it cannot result in any kind of regime change because they do not have the resources, they do not have leverage to do this. And these people, they're rather cowardly. They're not the material to do a coup. So they would prefer to just leave and maintain some of their assets and live a comfortable life in Dubai, for instance. If they're sanctioned in Europe, they will go to Middle East, they will go to Dubai, they will have these luxury apartments there and still have this lifestyle, and this will be enough for them. So so in terms of this, the oligarchs will not end the Russian regime. It should come from a different section of the elite, probably from inside the security apparatus. But it's like when I thought about this, it's not clear why would FSB people, for instance, want this regime to end. Because they do not have any opportunities for outside of this regime. So who would need FSB guys, right? So they have everything here, but they might lose everything if there is a democratization of the Russian regime. And so in that sense, it's not likely that a coup from inside the security apparatus will happen. But outside of it, the ruling class does not have real political power within this sort of arrangement.
Barbara is next. Do you want to unmute yourself, Barbara?
Yes. So I just wanted to comment something, which is that while I do not doubt that, or I totally agree with the classification of Putin as a sort of authoritarian Bonapartist figure, I think this makes sense. I'm a little surprised, or I wonder if it makes sense from a Marxist perspective to ignore the apparent connections, or can we really ignore that there is maybe a connection between figures like Navalny and somebody like Guaido, for example, Agnes, or other figures that are like Zelensky, I would even say. And I mean, the argument, and I don't want to excuse this obviously, right? But the argument from the Putin side is that he is a CIA-backed figure, right? And I mean, we all know that this happens all over the world. We know very clearly that the US has a political goal of deposing Putin, just as it had that goal in many other places across the world, and it's done that more or less successfully. There's a video of Hillary Clinton from the beginning of March saying that a lot of people in the US are looking at the situation in Ukraine in the same way that they looked at Afghanistan. And that, so comparing Zelensky's government to the Mujahideen, that if this government were to be funded and armed, that this war could last many years and that Russia could come out of it losing. And I just think that while it is, of course, legitimate to build up and conceive of a left opposition to Putin within Russia, we also have to understand the other side of what's going on, right? And I find it very strange to see an apparent alliance between a Marxist left and somebody like Navalny. And then I also think it's important to consider that Russia is at the moment at war with NATO, right? It's not just with Ukraine. It might be the beginning of a third world war. This war is with the US. So even the most liberal democratic country in such a dangerous context, certain liberties will be curtailed. And this is just in respect to, the government right now being very controlling of public demonstrations, political demonstrations on the right and the left. Considering, if you look at the history of Europe during Second World War, that was the kind of thing that was happening all the time. So I was just, but my question is, isn't there something similar between Navalny and Guaido and all of these springs that pop up in the world? And I don't mean to legitimate, to obviously defend that he should be, or the actions that Putin took against him, but can't it be that both sides are not great?
Yeah. So, first of all, I would say that Russia is not Latin America, and other parts of the world are not similar to Latin America in terms of the dynamics of American imperialism. So, Navalny is not supported by the CIA. It's just a fact. It's a plain fact that he is not supported by the CIA. And secondly, I disagree that the United States wants to depose Putin. It's not true. Up until the war, they were completely content with Putin's regime because Putin was integrated into this global network of corruption, and he was providing natural resources for the developed world, and he did not pose any kind of threat to the to global capitalism dominated by the West. And America was perfectly, content with having Putin in power, and they did not want any kind of regime change in Russia. And even now, I don't think it's true. I don't think that they want regime change in Russia. So, like, both sides are bad, or this type of argument, I disagree. I disagree because in authoritarian conditions, any kind of organization of the working class, which should be the goal of the left, is impossible. So any kind of progress that the left can achieve depends on the achievement of political democracy. Without political democracy, the left will be powerless in Russia, because the only alternative is a sort of Leninist type revolution that is impossible because of many different factors right now. It's impossible. So an armed uprising of the working class is impossible. Therefore, the progress of the working class depends on political democracy. So without political democracy, the left will be in the state where it is now. in a state of, just being repressed, being without any means to achieve any of its goals. And so, in that sense, there is no alliance with Navalny. It's not like we work for Navalny. It's not like we're part of his organization. There is, let's say, the fact that leftists go to opposition rallies that Navalny calls for, but it's not an organizational alliance in any sense. And I would say that the left, like I said, the left should always present its own program and be consistent in its commitments and always oppose Navalny on ideological grounds. But saying that both sides are bad at the current moment means political irrelevance, and this is just, like a pure position that you can feel good about this, that you criticize this faction of the bourgeoisie, you criticize that faction of the bourgeoisie, and then you just have no influence on anything at all. So you can feel good about yourself, but then it's meaningless. So in terms of Russia fighting with NATO, Russia curtailing liberties because it is fighting with NATO, in fact, all the liberties were curtailed before the war. So in our article, we write about the fact that every organized opposition in Russia was completely destroyed by the regime. Like everything that exists in Russia was destroyed. So Navalny's organization was completely destroyed by the regime. And all the other organizations, like hundreds of people, are in prison. And this happened before the war. It did not happen because of NATO. NATO has nothing to do with what happens in Russia now. This is another point that is still completely misunderstood by international left. So we try to talk about this as Russian socialists, but no one just listens to us. Everyone repeats NATO, NATO, NATO. It's not about NATO. It's about Russian imperialism, which is different from American imperialism. It has a different dynamic. It is driven by its own internal sources. It is not driven by NATO. Putin does what he does not because of NATO. Putin does it because of his extreme nationalism, imperial nationalism, and his actual desire to extend the Russian Empire. And what he said in his speeches, we should treat it as a literal cause for this war. He said that there is some kind of historic Russia that should unite Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and we are going to fight for this historic Russia. I think it's a better explanation of what's happening than a confrontation with NATO. Because if Putin wanted to beat NATO with war, then it was a losing project from the start. You cannot beat NATO by starting a war, because NATO suddenly now has a purpose. They say we're a defensive alliance, and we're going to increase our presence in Eastern Europe, which they do now. We're going to send nuclear weapons to Poland, and Putin can do nothing to stop it. He can't do anything to stop this. So, in fact, with this invasion, Putin actually expanded NATO presence in Europe. In that sense, he lost if his actual purpose was to stop the expansion of NATO. Now NATO is expanded, and he can't do anything about this. And in fact, he strengthened NATO by his actions. So NATO is much stronger than it was before, because Putin launched this war. So, my general comment would be that the left is based on the concrete analysis of concrete situation, let's say, and situation in Russia should be analyzed separately from situation in Venezuela, for instance, because in Venezuela it's a different dynamic. Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, they have a basis in the organization of the poor people and the organization of the working class. And the conflict that still, exists in Venezuela, it's a class conflict. In Russia, it's different. Putin is not a representative of the working class in any sense. He has no mass movement of the working class that supports him, like in any shape or form, on the one hand. On the other hand, America has zero influence on Russian opposition. Yes, America finances opposition in Latin American countries. It's true, because those countries are anti-American because of their leftist governments. In Russia, it's different. America does not finance anything. it has zero influence on Russian political dynamics. It's our own internal matter. And in that sense, like the bottom line is that we need to analyze specific situations according to what's going on and not just use some schemes that we use in different places, to analyze Russia, because it's a different thing. It's a different situation. And in that sense, the way the global left understands what's going on in our region needs to be updated. This is like the real thing. We need to produce a new theory of imperialism that will be able to account for Russia and not just for America and for NATO.
Richard Myers is up next.
Yes, thank you both to Ilya and Oleg for helping us to understand a little bit more of what's going on in Russia. My question sort of follows a little bit from the last one, but I want to sharpen one part of that. And that is, what do you think is the focus for the class analysis and the class audience for both one, Navalny's populism, and secondly, a Marxist left analysis of the situation? And I'm thinking in terms somewhat of, in your article, you talked about the four Russias and trying to understand the complexity of the situation there. I know those are not necessarily seen as classes. There are class elements in each of those four categories. But if we're looking at those four Russias and maybe more specific class formations in Russia, where is the appeal from Navalny and for a Marxist left analysis? And is that appeal, to what degree is that appeal having any progress or finding an audience among those different class formations within Russia?
Right. So we try to base our class analysis on this idea that indeed Russia is divided between four big, let's say, social groups. And among these social groups, two groups are the biggest. On the one hand, you have people who live in big cities, middle-class professionals with higher education. On the other hand, you have the working class. The working class is the industrial working class that lives in smaller cities with some remnants of Soviet industry, or maybe they are deindustrializing now, but this is like the working class. Also, the working class lives in big cities as well and works in the service industry just like in any other country in the world. So Navalny tries to unite these two groups of people by just by populism, by rejecting a consistent program. So the definition of populism is that instead of a program, you have just a symbol, right? Like we're the 99%, for instance. It's not a political program. It's more like a slogan that can potentially unite completely different people. And in that sense, like I said, programmatically, Navalny is inconsistent. And there is also like, it doesn't make sense to talk about his organization because it no longer exists. But when it existed, there was a real problem that on the one hand, he had some social demands, and Navalny's rhetoric was frequently it was not left-leaning, but it included a lot of social demands for increasing the welfare state, increasing pensions, increasing education and healthcare spending, and such. So, but on the other hand, the economists around Navalny who prepared some concrete, programs for him, some concrete reforms that he popularized. So these economists, they're completely neoliberal, right? And potentially this is going to be a huge problem. Like if Navalny comes to power, he's going to be a neoliberal politician, and it will be the task of the left to principally oppose everything he wants to do in Russia. But I would say that the left will have much bigger chances to do anything in a democratic setting where Navalny is president, rather than in the authoritarian setting than Putin is president. So in terms of opposing Navalny, this will have some chance of actually influencing government policy, because Navalny will be exposed as inconsistent leader without a real program that pronounces social stuff and actually does so. Let's say talks left, walks right. So this is the expression. So this will be exposed, and then the left will have a chance to stand out with its more consistent program. But yeah, so in that sense, the left should already build a broad coalition as well, and this coalition should be built around just ordinary people. It should not be built around this like middle class people or those who are left in Moscow and Petersburg. It should be built around ordinary people. It should be sensitive to their concrete situation. And so the propaganda should be focused on ordinary people and on working class people. And at the same time, like I said, in the present situation, when there is no organized opposition, including left opposition, so the left in Russia exists in a sort of ephemeral state. So if it tries to go beyond websites, lectures, some small scale like activist activity, then it is immediately crushed by the regime, right? So in that sense, to talk about sort of trying to appeal to the working class is very difficult because it is politically impossible, right? So Russia is not the same as it was in 1917, when there was also like a violent authoritarian regime, but at the same time there was a very militant working class that was receptive to the leadership of the communist movement. So now it is different. There is no working class that is receptive to that, and that is militant.
John, you have a comment or a question? You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you for that. Ilya, it was great listening to you. It's very difficult, as you can imagine, for us in the West to get any clear idea of the events that are going in the situation in Russia. I do want to, give you some feedback on your sense that NATO has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. Just to go back to the 90s, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, there was a sense that Gorbachev got a commitment from Reagan not to go past East Germany. When Clinton came in, that was thrown out, and the Clinton administration proceeded to organize and fund the color revolutions in the former Warsaw Pact countries. And they, many high-ranking American officials, CIA people, diplomats, other intellectuals, warned Washington not to go to Russia's border because the war that's happening there now would be happening. It was, in a sense, a war foretold. Putin, for the last 20 years, has been saying exactly that. Please don't come to our borders. We understand here that there are American missiles in Poland and Romania aimed at Moscow. So it's very hard for us to accept that there is no, there's no NATO. I always think of this US/NATO because NATO is a creation of the United States, that they don't have an invested interest here. I'm going to allude partially to what Barbara was saying earlier, that there is a perception that there is in fact two aspects to this war. The first aspect is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war that it's perpetrating on Ukraine. But there's another level of the war that's going on, another aspect, and that's the inter-imperial war between Russia and the United States. One aspect of that seems to be quite relevant is that during the Maidan days, the #1 American politician in the Ukraine, Victoria Nuland, was publicly announced that she was very proud that the Americans had poured $5 billion into the Ukraine in effort to alienate it from Russia and turn it towards the West. Now, I'm sure that there's underlying reasons why they would do that without $5 billion. But $5 billion can do a lot of persuading. And that only not dollars, those dollars were buying talent, resources, and were particularly in the younger generation, were training them in the various social media platforms to generate a more sympathetic, Western view in Ukraine. So that is some of the reasons why leftists in the West are more focused on, or particularly focused on NATO's role. And here in Canada, of course, we are sitting on top of one of the American empire, or the source of the American empire. So we have of course, a different point of view from what is going on in other parts of the world. So can you comment on that, please?
Okay, so the first thing about the so-called color revolutions, they were not inspired or created by the United States. It's not true on the factual level, because this kind of statement is not in the spirit of Marxist analysis. So any kind of, it's not a revolution in the Marxist sense, obviously, because there was no victory for the working class or anything like this. But at the same time, Marxism emphasizes objectively existing contradictions in society, and not some kind of inspiration by a foreign power or something like this. So these movements in Eastern European countries, they were caused by internal contradictions, which were abundant, in those countries. And in many ways, like many of those so-called color revolutions, they were actually democratic movements. I mean, yes, they were supported by the United States, but this did not in any way alter their dynamic, and this was not decisive in the fact that those color revolutions happened. So this was not about America. Like post-Soviet space is not Latin America, it's a different region. It was not about America in any sense. It was about the internal contradictions of these societies. So the problem with these democratic movements in countries like Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, so those places where those democratic movements happened, the problem was that these movements in themselves, they were not socialist movements, right? And no one claims that. This was a mixed class movement with different factions of, society joining together, and without clear, consistent list of demands, without a clear class nature. But the fact that those movements did not have a clear class nature does not make them into American-inspired coup d'etat or something like this. This is just simply not true. And this was never true about Maidan. It was not an American-created coup. It was not a coup d'etat at all. It was a real social movement that deposed a regime that was consolidating its authoritarian rule. Because when you have 100,000 people on the streets who are ready to go under bullets, snipers firing at them, this is not a coup. This is a real social movement. And we as leftists might not like it because it was not led by leftists, but to deny that it was a real movement of the people is to deny reality. So this is what about, those color revolutions, so-called color revolutions. And in fact, this is Putin's worldview. This is exactly what he is saying. Any kind of democratic movement in any post-Soviet country is just an avatar of American power. So this is Putin's narrative, and this is what you can, if you watch Russian TV, this is exactly what they tell you. But this is just a denial of reality. So the question of NATO. Absolutely, it's true that American imperialism has interests in the post-Soviet region. So yeah, I do not deny that. And NATO expansion was a way for the United States to weaken Russian presence in the region. But then again, so to answer this with military action will always be counterproductive. So in Ukraine, more than 60% of people opposed like Ukraine joining NATO even a couple of years ago. But after Putin started to concentrate the troops on the Ukrainian border, this number went down to 20% for an obvious reason that who will protect Ukraine if not NATO? Like this isn't just sort of obvious that when you have 200,000 soldiers with tanks, with everything stationed on your borders, obviously people want to join NATO. Now it becomes a popular demand, and instead of threatening military action, Putin's other option was to try to create an attractive model of social organization, of political organization, so that Ukraine would naturally gravitate towards Russia, just because, Ukrainian people do not want NATO, they want closer ties with Russia. This was possible if only Russian regime was not a kleptocratic Bonapartist regime, but precisely because it is a regime that has nothing to offer to the Russian population or to the population of Ukraine, like Putin completely lost Ukrainian people, and this is why he decided to launch the invasion. But this invasion will not help him to fight American imperialism in any way. Short term, medium term, long term, he already lost this. It just doesn't make sense to launch an invasion on a country in order to stop NATO expansion. So, and in fact, as a leftist, obviously I oppose NATO expansion. I don't like NATO. And as a Russian, I remember the bombing of Serbia, and NATO is not a defensive alliance because of this. So when they repeat, we're defensive alliance, so everyone saw what happened in Serbia. But at the same time, with this goal of opposing NATO, now I see that NATO will encircle Russia, and there is nothing that Russia can do with this because of this invasion. Because now Poland said that it will welcome nuclear missiles. They were not stationed in Poland and Romania before, by the way, it's just not true. But now they will be stationed there because Putin has launched this war, and this is inevitable. Like no one could do anything with this. Now Russia will be truly encircled by NATO. And I think that at some points Ukraine will also join NATO, just because Putin cannot stop it now in any way. So his only choice was actually to influence the populations of these countries, because originally in Ukraine, no one wanted to join NATO. Ukrainian people did not have these demands. And all this persuading by Victoria Nuland was just useless for this. There was, yes, there was some kind of civil society with some European and American backing, but it was completely marginal. But now people do want to join NATO. If you ask an ordinary Ukrainian, he would say not only that we want to join NATO, but let's throw a nuclear bomb at Russia in order to stop, Russia from killing our children. And this is completely understandable. So in that sense, making this war about NATO, so everyone understands this. But Putin doesn't understand this. So we should think like this. Like we understand that NATO will expand in presence because of the war, but Putin somehow didn't understand this. It's very difficult to get this position. And in that sense, Russian imperialism is not yes, there is an inter-imperial rivalry, but it was not directly caused by NATO expansion. I think the reasons for this war are different. These reasons are ideological, and these reasons lie in irredentist Russian nationalism, imperial Russian nationalism. And that was developing inside the Russian state, and finally it's, expressed itself in this way. So, yep.
Previn, myself, and Wiley are on spec. Wiley, Previn's spoken before, so I'm going to call on Wiley first. You want to unmute yourself? Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm not an expert, but I understand there was a political opening in Russia in the 1990s, and that this decade also saw a massive decrease in the welfare of the working class. So I wonder, from a materialist perspective, what does the working class have to gain in replacing Putin with a populist leader if the politics of the populist movement are so eclectic? I wondered if there are any specific issues in Russia that are seen as particularly galvanizing for the left, and what the role of the Communist Party is in Russian politics, what their attitude is toward Putin. So it's a couple questions, but that's what I'm
Yeah, actually, if I could jump in, because I had a similar question I was going to ask about the role of the I guess what you call the red-brown, the old nostalgic nationalist Russian Communist Party, because I guess that still is the only functioning really opposition party in Russia, and I've heard that they are expected to do very well in the next parliamentary election, if there is one. And I'm wondering, is there any chance that that party evolving into something other than an old nostalgic nationalist party, if more young people were to get interested in it, because it does seem to me that only a mass movement can change the current regime in Russia, and a mass movement is possible, as we have seen under Latin American dictatorships. It is possible if the working classes can. There are ways to organize people under repressive regimes. So, if you want to put those two questions together, you can.
Right. So the question about the Communist Party. First of all, the Communist Party is not an opposition in any sense, because Russian political system does not work as a Western-style parliamentary democracy. The Communist Party is subordinated to the Kremlin. There is a special department within the administration of the president that deals with all parliamentary parties in Russia. And the person who heads this department has Gennady Zyuganov, the leader of the Communist Party. He can just call him and say how he should vote on any measure. So it is just part of the regime. It's one of the auxiliaries of the Russian regime. It exists to absorb the discontent of a certain group of people and then make something completely meaningless out of it. So the Communist Party it does not exist as an agent of anything. It is just part of this, infrastructure of the regime. And when the regime decides that it no longer needs the Communist Party, so it will be just shut down, and Zyuganov will not protest this in any way. So, on the other hand, on the level of some grassroots activists that still exist within the Communist Party, although there were a series of purges, and all of them, they were expelled. Like most of them, they were expelled. The purges started in the 90s, and ironically, all of these people who were expelled from the Communist Party, they were called Trotskyists, even though the actual Trotskyists was like 1% of them. Just all the people who had a truly leftist orientation, they were expelled and called Trotskyists. So, in any case, the Communist Party is not like something we place our hopes in. at the same time, there are several organizations of people who were expelled from the Communist Party. Now they exist independently. These organizations have some agency. They have some connections maybe with the working class. And what we witness now is a split in those like communist leftist organizations on the question of war. So some people support the war, even among those, those who were expelled from the Communist Party. Some people reject the war, and now these organizations are split. And by the way, the Communist Party is one of the most fervent supporters of this invasion. So this is important to understand. I mean, I don't think that like people in the West actually grasp this, that Zyuganov is one of the most vocal supporters of this war. And all of the ensuing atrocities and the destruction of the lives of Ukrainians. Actually, Zyuganov supports the war 100%. So, in that sense, if there is going to be a working organization of the working class, I don't think that it will be connected to the Communist Party in any way. Maybe some people who were, by the way, if there are some people like politicians who have some agency who are members of the Communist Party, paradoxically, I understand that like you don't want to hear this, but paradoxically they owe their positions to Navalny, because Navalny has the strategy of so-called smart voting, tactical voting, and that meant voting for the Communist Party in single mandate districts. And so Navalny actually supported Communist Party candidates. And if there are some people in the Communist Party now who have some conscience left and who are willing even to oppose the war, this is because Navalny helped to get them elected. So, I mean, this is the reality that we have in Russia. And like when people say that Navalny is just a CIA created candidate who is just against, whatever. So Navalny actually, there was a tactical alliance between Navalny and those aspiring politicians who work within the framework of the Communist Party. But they always faced pressure from the leadership of the Communist Party, from Zyuganov, because essentially the leadership was controlled by the regime, and those aspiring, people, they did not owe their position to Zyuganov, they owed their position to Navalny and to people who voted for them. So that's the situation now. So for instance, in Moscow, there is a member of the Moscow parliament, of the municipal parliaments, called Evgeny Stupin. He is now a member of, he's a member of the Communist Party, but he's against the war. So, but Stupin was elected he got his seat in the Moscow parliament because Navalny supported him as a candidate. So in that sense, Navalny was quite helpful in creating any kind of opposition to the war, even within the Communist Party. So the question about the working class. So do I understand correctly that you want to hear about the economic dynamics, right?
I wonder what are the
Well, also the question of people coming, there's going to be casualties, physical casualties from this war. Most of them will be, poor guys. And certainly in the United States during Vietnam, that the impact of that on building opposition was very important. So maybe you could throw that in too when we're talking about the working class.
Yeah, so it's true, and I think there will be a very real impact because the number of casualties is staggering in this war. Even official numbers were, several weeks ago, the number that they claimed was 1,400 people, which is several times lower than the real number of casualties. And even this official number, it did not include the people from Donbass, those so-called militias of these people's republics. and it did not include these mercenary groups like Wagner. It was only the Russian army, and from the army, the official figure was 1,400 people. So during the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, it was something like 3,000 people. And I think already, and it was 10 years. I think already the number of casualties in this conflict is higher than all the people who died in Afghanistan during the Soviet war. So this will have an impact, and the question is, like, I think it is already having an impact, and I think there is discontent and frustration sort of emerging in different sections of Russian society, including the working class. The question is, what can they do in this situation, these people? So how can they express this discontent? So because I don't see how this can play out. So maybe in the long run, like I said, there are going to be some kind of desperate actions by people, some kind of demonstrations, and driven by desperation, economic desperation, and the fact that like dead soldiers are coming to Russia, and maybe this will have some impact on also the elite, on the cohesion in the elite. This might drive some kind of conflicts within the elite, but immediately I don't see that how this can impact like anything. So
I guess
yeah.
my question is specifically to like the economic platform of the opposition, if they're offering something economically better to the working class.
Right. So so the problem is that it's very difficult to organize the working class on economic demands in the conditions of economic crisis, because there is no leverage. And when workers are being fired, when they lose their jobs, so it's for instance, trade union activity is basically like impossible. Even if we put aside political pressure, there is this problem that trade unions cannot grow when there is economic decline. So there was a period in the 2000s, then there was rather strong growth in the Russian economy, and there were places in Russia where there was industrial growth, sort of re-industrialization, and independent trade unions actually followed this process of re-industrialization in places like St. Petersburg and the area around St. Petersburg. There was like a group of automobile factories built there, producing automobiles for Western brands. Also places like Kaluga with automobile factories, all kinds of manufacturing, like manufacturing companies coming to these areas, and there were independent trade unions, quite militant trade unions, but most of them, well, so automotive industry is finished in Russia. So it was in deep crisis before, but now without components that arrive from Europe, all of these factories are just closed currently. So they do not work because they do not receive components from the West. So currently it's a furlough for the workers, but I think that they will not reopen. So in that sense, so how do you organize the working class if the factories are not working? So that's a big problem. Like one of the successes was organizing public sector employees. For instance, there is a healthcare workers union, an independent healthcare workers union that is quite successful, and that is still successful. So they organized a lot of doctors who are actually, and also nurses who are in Russia, all public employees, because Russian healthcare is fully, it's a state-run healthcare. So the same with teachers. There is an independent union of school teachers, and there were some successes there. So the economic crisis in Russia basically lasts from 2014, and stagnation began more than a decade ago. And so advances in industrial working class were not there. But in the public sector, there were some successes. And I think that in any potential improvement of the political situation, like public sector, trade unions will be important. So this is how I would answer this.
We're really out of time. I don't know if we have time for Previn and Michael. We're on Stack. If Michael has nothing, okay.
No, I would invite Oleg and Ilya back for another time, and we'll take up other questions then. It would be great.
Yeah.
Ilya and Oleg, thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.
Really a great effort.
Very enlightening. Greg, did you want to chime in?
I'd just like to thank Ilya and Oleg. Oleg, we're sorry you couldn't arrive a bit earlier. I'm sure Ilya would have liked it too, to ease some of his burden. And I guess thank you again for the marvelous article. It kind of, as you mentioned, the things of the developments of subsequently have kind of changed some of the weight of the article, but I think it also still prefaces a lot of what you analyze in terms of the developments of the war, which I think most of us are concurrent in terms of what you're analyzing in terms of Russia. But there was an angle that's also in the volume that's also looking at America's global strategy, coming from Walden Bello in the Philippines and analyzing the conflict between China and Russia, emphasizing a couple of things about the longer term American geopolitical strategy and how it shapes up in this moment. And for us in North America, in particular, the fusion of that strategy in terms of forward positioning of NATO and especially American troops, which now Canada is in the process of doing too, also developing our own bases in a few parts of the world for that forward positioning. The upgrading of the defense systems, particularly the nuclear launch systems, is important, and also the general strategy which they've have employed everywhere, and we see them trying to employ it now in the China Sea, of overmatch, of just building, and bringing things to the point of a boil or confrontation as part of a kind of geopolitical politics, is an important, to me, dimension of this. With, I think, then what you say about the misreadings of and Putin on strategy, plus the kind of politics around it, underneath it, is why this conflict is so uncontrollable, with kind of possible unintended consequences of all kinds that we still have a hard time probably making any kind of conclusions about or calculations about. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was really good to see something that we're not getting here much on. Even the media on the war is very at the best open to some dissidents in Russia, but not kind of the dissident notes that you and Oleg were bringing in your essay, and a wider view of understanding the types of politics that underpin the Russian regime, and why then this conflict has taken on the form it has. So thank you very much for your comments, Ilya, and for the insightful essay.
Thank you.
And Oleg, sorry, and Oleg, we wish we
Thank you,
had
everybody
more of your comments.
Yeah, and don't forget next month, the last of the 4 sessions, and maybe we'll have a follow-up if we can get David Harvey and the Brazilians back.
Yeah, maybe the final thing I'd say. The final thing I'd say, we have actually had a long history in the Register of trying to get in our pages the best Russian intellectuals. We've had Buskalin in the past, Kagerlatsky, Western commentators who have been immersed in Russian and Eastern European debates, Peter Gowan and David Mandel. So we've always had kind of a range of this, and we're very pleased on that basis as well that we're able to have Ilya and Oleg in our pages this year.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, and don't forget next Tuesday, not this Tuesday, but the Tuesday after, the talk about the climate change struggle, revolutions from below, which is kind of relevant to the question of revolutions from below. So, all right, thank you all.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank
David,
you.
Hi. Thank you.
The entire group that came. Great day. Thank you. We'll have a video ready later in the week.